Hi everybody, and welcome to this 7-part video series on how to go from sim racing to real racing. A few years ago I became a licensed racing driver and spent 2 years racing at many of the circuits around the UK. In this video series I'll hopefully share my story and try to offer advice for anybody else that would like to do this themselves. So in part 7 I'm going to look at how much it actually costs to go racing and basically conclude about my experience and whether you should go racing yourself. So for anybody who doesn't know, they haven't watched the previous videos, go and watch them. But just to let you know, we're basically racing in a team endurance series in an Integra Type R. We raced for about 2 years and we raced at circuits all around the UK. So in this video, I'm going to actually look at what the costs were and ultimately whether I think it was worth the money that I spent. I did say it's worth watching the other videos first because I'm going to skirt over some of the actual details of things and only really look at the costs in this. So in particular, part 2 and part 3, and maybe a highlighted race, because those videos will actually give you the details of the things that I'm spending the money on. So throughout this, I'm going to give my costs when I went racing, but I'll also look at a real world example today, such as the Civic Cup. So we're going to start with some really basic costs. As discussed in video 3, you're going to need a Go Racing starter pack, you may need a medical, and you're going to need an ARDS test to actually get your National B licence. I believe the licence fee is included in the first starter pack, so you shouldn't need to pay for that again. But in total, that's going to come to £419. So next thing we're going to look at is actually racewear. I suggest obviously that you follow the advice of video 2 and 3 first, found a series, registered, etc, before you buy any of this stuff, because it's so important that the regulations of your series will dictate what sort of level of equipment you're going to need. And so here you can see that I've highlighted that it's FIA 8856-2000 approved, and that is the series that I needed that, for example. So another £345. So that takes us to 764. After the race suit, you're going to need a helmet. Once again, you need to make sure that it's approved for your series. It will be more expensive than a normal helmet that isn't approved for your series. And you can see here, this one's £396. You might be able to get one cheaper, and obviously there'll be ones that are more expensive. But remember, this is the thing that's protecting your head or your skull if you're going to have an accident. It's definitely not something you want to skimp or save on. Make sure it matches your regulations and make sure it's a good quality helmet. That takes us up to a total of £1,160. So we're going to need some race boots. There's a story about this on, I think, the 3rd video, where the person I was racing with didn't have the correct race boots and I actually had to swap my shoes with them. So make sure it definitely matches the regs for you. And after that, gloves as well. Sometimes series don't need gloves that are fireproof and sometimes they do, so obviously you need to check that. But now we're up to a total of £1,344. So we're now onto the car, and obviously this could be way cheaper, it could be way more expensive. As we saw on video 2, for the Civic Cup series, for example, you could actually buy a car outright for about £14,000. Now that's a lot of money, but that car is ready to race, basically ready to go for that series. And I'll return back to my own costs shortly, but looking at some of these costs on the Civic Cup website, they give you a bit of an idea of if you were to try to build a car, how much that would actually cost. They basically list out all the mandatory parts you'd need, all the normal parts that they'd recommend buying for that car. And you can see on the mandatory parts list, you've got a total of 3,681. And on the other parts list, you've got a total of 6,254. So add those two up and you've got a total of £9,935 just in parts. And you would need to buy a Civic Type R to actually fit them to. So let's say that's £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, whatever. And then you've actually got to fit it all. So obviously, if you're doing it yourself, that might be free, but you've still got the tools and everything else. But let's say that you actually take it to a garage to get it fitted. You're going to be talking thousands of pounds worth of labour and it's certainly worth having it done correctly. So already all the parts plus the labour plus the car, you've got a price here that's more than £14,000. So that car that you could have bought outright actually seems a lot cheaper than actually building one. And that's one of the mistakes people think, is they think, oh no, it'll be cheaper to build one, but it often works out much more expensive. So returning to my example, we went the build your own car route, and that was because we couldn't afford to buy a race car. We did make money back by selling bits off as we went through, but straight away the fact that we were racing an Integra Type R was quite expensive. I think we picked this one up for £4,500, completely standard. You can see in the background the Clio that I bought previously that I wanted to race. I bought that only up for £1,400, I think. So the Integra was actually quite an expensive route to go, but I was splitting the cost with my friend. That's obviously a standard car. We're already up to £5,844. We haven't done anything to it. So we picked up this race spec coilover kit. I think we got it for about £1,000 second hand. To save money, we did a lot of the labour ourselves, so obviously it cost us nothing to fit parts, strip the car out, so completely gut the interior out, repaint the car, understeel it, fix any rust, etc, etc. This is all free for us. So I don't have the exact cost at hand, but all the brake upgrades, basically new discs all round, new pads all round, new fluid, some of the braided lines. Eventually we fitted a brake bias valve and other bits and pieces. It's easily £1,000, and this probably was a running cost because we'd go through discs quite regularly and pads even faster than that. We fitted a new exhaust system that I think was about £760, really lightweight. Probably didn't need to do this, but ultimately we wanted the weight saving and the performance gain from it. So I don't remember us doing too much to the engine. I know obviously the usual like plugs, filter, new oil, etc, etc. The main bit was in remapping it, so I think we had to buy an aftermarket ECU to allow us to remap it, and then the remap was something like £400, and that also let us raise the limit as well, the rev limiter. So let's just round it up to £950 on the engine. And then there were tyres as well. So I think they were about £600 to £700 a set. We actually went through quite a few sets over the couple of years, but I've included one set for here, just taking us up over 10 grand. And then there were costs for things that we did over time. So at some point we added a plate diff that made a huge difference, and that was £1,400, I believe. I can't remember if that was second hand, but that's what it cost. Then you've got the race seats, so obviously these had to be the correct spec. We did actually end up with two of them because we used it for track days and stuff as well. But obviously you can half that for the cost for one. And if you've got race seats, you obviously need approved seat mountings. So we obviously had two sets of this, but you could halve it and only have one. And with the seats come harnesses. I can't remember if we had 4 or 6 point harnesses, but let's just go with 4 point. Obviously they have to be approved. Once again, we had two sets, so this is just my costs, but ultimately you can halve that if you're only going to run one seat ever. So one of probably the most important ones is the roll cage. I think this was about £600 to £700 for the actual cage. Then you actually had to have it fitted. I think you can have some bolted in, but we got ours welded in. This obviously, the labour to get that fitted would be quite expensive. This is where we had the advantage that my other driver had a deal with the garage, and I can't even remember if they charged us fitting for this. And then there were similar things to that, like the fire extinguisher, the ability to pull the fire extinguisher from the internal and external, the engine cut-off, etc. So the fire extinguisher, obviously we paid for the parts, but once again all the fitting of this was just done by our garage. Same with the engine cut-off and everything else. So I've just rounded us up to £300 plus fitting, but if you're going to have to get the labour of a garage doing this, and I suggest it's done properly, this might actually cost more than what it's shown here. And then there's loads of little bits and pieces, like you need to have bonnet pins or catches. Same with the boot. That's just so that if your engine blows up or something like that, the marshals can open the bonnet without actually having to go to the car and open it. Similar with this, I think rain light and stuff like that you need as well. And I think there'll be way more as well. Like, for example, we fitted poly bushes all round, I believe. I think perhaps thicker front and rear anti-roll bars and tow hooks and all sorts of stuff. The list is basically almost endless. I remember at the time just always having to transfer more money. Basically, the way me and my friend did it is we had a joint bank account to put all the money that we were racing from, and we'd transfer half the money in each time that we have to spend money, and then it would go out of that joint bank account. So yeah, it was just endless costs going through, and this is in theory a very budget way of doing it. We were trying to keep everything on the low and selling back parts and just doing everything as cheap as we could. So there was a fixed cost. I think you had to pay something like £300 a year or something like that to be a member of the club and actually enter the series as a whole. And then I seem to think, if I remember correctly, that each race was something like £350 to £370 per race just to enter a race. And this does not include the test day that you could have optionally had on the Friday that was another £200 or so. Then how do you get your car to the racetrack? So if it's not road legal or there's a risk of crashing or anything like that, you need to have a trailer. And we hired a trailer every time, and I think they charge per day, but obviously you're going for a weekend, so you'd have to get the trailer on the Friday, you load it up on the Saturday, you'd go to the racetrack, you'd do your race on the Saturday or the Sunday, you bring it back, you drop it off on the Monday. Even then, it's cost you £100 to £150 to hire that trailer for that many days. I'd then say fuel and what I'd call fluids. So you obviously had fuel for the race car, which we generally brought with us in jerry cans, but sometimes you could buy it at the track. You've then got fuel for the thing that's towing the race car there and back, and obviously having to go and pick up the trailer and all these things. As well as this, you've got fluids, so oil obviously, maybe coolant, maybe brake fluid if you have to change your brakes. There's a whole range of things here. I've just rounded up to £150 per race. So I've just put food and misc here. Obviously, I haven't included a cost for this just because it could vary, but you have to keep in mind that you've got potentially people that are coming with you that are going to help team-wise, so help you set up the car and help on the pit wall, etc., etc. Obviously the other driver, etc. They all need to be fed and everything else, and why should they be paying for meals when you're getting them to help you out and stuff? So yeah, just keep this in mind that you've also got that cost on top every single race. So this is a difficult one. Obviously this could vary depending on what the situation is, but ultimately tyres, brakes, etc., they're going to need to be replaced. I think we replaced them a few times a season, both brakes and tyres. So yeah, basically let's just say £200 a race averaged out over the whole time. That's probably a low estimate, to be honest, but I think that probably helps us calculate some costs. So in total, with all those costs combined, you're looking at about £850 a race, give or take. Obviously, there would be more costs sometimes and less others. Saying that we did about 8 to 10 rounds, so let's just say 10 over the 2 years, that brings the total just in the per race cost to £8,500. And then if we add that to the total from earlier, that brings a total cost for the 2 years worth of racing, everything included, to £22,085 or 27,272 American dollars. So this total cost really puts into perspective that trophy sitting there. Yeah, it's great to win a race, but oh my God, how much is this trophy cost us to win this race? And ultimately this starts a bit about my conclusion on whether it's really worth it. For me, I shared a lot of this cost with my other driver, so you can kind of halve it more or less, I think. We also obviously did save more money than this, but there's probably more costs that I've forgotten about. Some costs we could reclaim at the end of it, so we sold the car, for example, and sold some of the bits. But a lot of the money is basically gone. And for me, when I did this, I was quite young, so I was working full time, but I had to move back with my parents to save money. And yeah, I kind of remember this kind of being most of my money going out to pay for this at the time when I went racing. Now, for me personally, it was a dream that I'd always wanted to do, so I had to go racing. Always wanted to do it, and so it was worth spending that money. But after 2 years, I then questioned whether I wanted to do it anymore. And especially with the costs, you kind of start to question, well, could I be spending this money on something better? I think one thing that didn't really help too much was that you spent all this money, you spent all this time, and then as with the Brands Hatch video that I showed on my part 5, you had people turning up that, in my opinion, were flouting the rules, claiming their car was a certain class when it really wasn't, and nobody did anything about it. I remember other occasions where people just turned up in full-blown race cars that there's no way this car was the same class. It was way, way too powerful. And yeah, nobody really did anything. So that kind of put a bit of a damper on it, because you spent all this money and everything, and then it's not even a fair game. And I think that is motorsport. Cheating happens, and you just got to get used to it a bit. But the other aspect is that you start to realise it's all just about money. So our series was a relatively budget series designed for newcomers, and I remember this one team that turned up had a full-blown massive race trailer, the sort of things that you see in an F1 paddock. He had a whole crew of 4 or 5 mechanics. They had a car that I think was an ex-touring car that they'd just bought and brought down to race, which was just crazy because it was like 100 grand's worth of car or something like that. They had all the spares, all the gear, and he obviously didn't do anything on the day other than turn up and drive. And I remember we'd watched this lot all unpack their stuff, and this Porsche GT3 turned up, I think a green one or something like that. And I commented to one of the mechanics, I was like, wow, this guy's got like so much money, like he's got all this stuff. And the mechanic laughed and said yesterday he turned up in his white Porsche GT3. So he had so much money that he's got 2 different coloured Porsche GT3s, plus all this trailer and all that sort of stuff. And you are sort of in disbelief that they're even trying to race in a series like yourself. But then, as I covered in, I think it was video 3, who knows, maybe he's just trying to get the bottom license so that he can progress up, and maybe he's going to go into a much higher series eventually, and he's got the money for it. And so this comes back to that main question, should you go racing? Ultimately, if you can afford it and it's something you've always wanted to do, you should do it. Hopefully in this 7-part video series, I've made it quite clear about what is involved and the sort of costs and everything else. So if you've been sim racing, you've done some go-karting, you've done a track day, you've got enough money that you can actually afford to realistically do this, and you want to do it, then yes, you should go racing. I think everybody should go racing. And I'm sort of closing on this picture here because you can see my smile, even though it's cost all this money, even though we've been cheated out of wins, even though I haven't really covered in some of the other videos that we actually had quite a few mechanical breakdowns and the car would fail on us and therefore we would not finish. I was still smiling. At the end of the day, it was something I'd always wanted to do, and I finally was actually doing it. So yes, if you can afford it, do it. So is this the end of my racing journey? Will I never go racing again? What's next for me? So right now I've got this YouTube channel, Pro Sim Racer, and I'm enjoying doing sim racing because it's a lot cheaper and easier than doing the real racing, and hopefully you guys will join me on that journey and subscribe. I'd like to one day return to real racing. I would have continued racing if I could have afforded to keep doing it previously, and maybe one day if I can grow this channel large enough, this might actually help me get back to actually doing that for real. So if you're not a subscriber here, please subscribe. I'm going to be doing more content, probably aiming at newbies and people wanting to go faster in simulators and stuff like that. So definitely stick around if you like this content, and as always, like it, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Thanks all.